The plains were quiet in the early light, the kind of quiet that made a man listen to his own breath as if it belonged to someone else. The grass barely moved, the wind had not woken up yet, and the hills waited in the pale shade of dawn. A lone cowboy rode across that wide land, steady in the saddle, dust on his hat and hope in his heart. Folks in the region knew him as a man who worked hard, spoke little, and carried his past the way others carried saddlebags. There was nothing special about him at first glance, yet there was something in his eyes that made people think he had walked through storms they could not imagine. He had come west, chasing a life he could build with his own hands, far from noise and far from trouble. He traveled with a worn map in his pocket, though he trusted the land more than the lines drawn on paper. For weeks, he had been drifting near Apache territory, careful to respect what did not belong to him. Many cowboys ignored those lines, believing every place without a fence was theirs to take. But he had seen enough conflict to understand that a man's choices could lift him or bury him. So he stayed close to the riverbeds and kept his distance from the sacred lands, marked by old carvings and stories carried through generations. One afternoon, when the heat shimmered off the stones and the air tasted like dust, his horse kicked at something under the sand. He climbed down, brushed aside the dirt, and froze when he saw a dull glint. It was not the shine of a lost trinket or a broken buckle. It was heavier, richer. He dug a little more, his heart beating harder with every handful of earth he removed. Soon a chunk of pure gold lay in his palm, a piece so heavy that it pulled his hand down, a piece so bright that it could change a man's life. For better or worse, he looked around the empty landscape. No riders in sight, no footprints but his own. The sun sat high as if watching what he would do next. It would have been easy to pocket the gold, ride east, and sell it for enough money to buy land. Cattle, a house, maybe even start a family? He had dreamed of those things on long nights under cold skies. Yet something held him still. The gold was deep in Apache land, a place where he had no claim and no right to take anything. He had heard stories of sacred ground where treasures were not treasures but signs, warnings or memories carved in earth by ancestors. Some cowboys joked about curses. He did not believe in curses, but he believed in respect. He lifted the gold, felt its weight, and then slowly placed it back in the hole. His hands covered it with sand until not a single shine remained. Before mounting his horse, he paused and whispered that he meant no harm. It felt strange talking to empty land, but he knew it was not empty. Someone or something watched him, even if he could not see them. For the next few days he rode on, leaving the hills behind, unaware that a pair of young Apache scouts had seen everything from the ridge. They had watched his movements, seen him uncover the gold, and expected him to steal it as others had tried before. Instead, he did the one thing they never imagined. He walked away. They returned to their camp carrying news that did not fit the usual stories about cowboys. The cowboy, meanwhile, kept moving toward the small cattle towns that dotted the frontier. He worked odd jobs, helped mend fences, herded strays, and earned just enough to eat and keep his horse healthy. Gold would have made life easier, but he never regretted leaving it. He believed some things were not meant to be touched. Seasons changed. Tracks he once followed faded. He crossed rivers that dried into cracked beds and later filled again with rain. He met people who stayed in his memory and others who drifted away like dust in a windstorm. 13 years passed in the way frontier years do, slow and fast at the same time. The cowboy grew older, not old, but with lines on his face that told of long roads and quiet battles. He still lived with honor, still kept to himself, and still felt the land calling him every morning. But time had a way of returning what a man gave, whether good or bad. What he did not know was that the tribe had never forgotten him. The scouts who once saw him had grown into respected men. They had spoken of him by fireside, told their children about the cowboy who chose respect over greed. Among the elders, the story became part of their teachings, a reminder that even outsiders could show honor. So when their land and their people faced trouble many years later, the memory of that cowboy rose again like an old trail, revealing itself after rain. The cowboy was working near a small ranch when he first noticed things changing. Strangers were riding around the valley asking questions that made folks uneasy. These men talked about new mining rights, expansion, and pushing boundaries farther than they should. Rumors spread that they had set their eyes on the same Apache land where he once found the buried gold. Some ranchers shrugged it off. Others warned that the tribe would not allow it. Tension rose like heat waves off the ground. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the land, he felt a strange pull. The past he had tried to leave behind seemed to be calling him back. The wind carried the faint sound of distant drums, though he could not be sure if it was memory or truth. Something inside told him he needed to return to those hills. Not for gold, not for treasure, but because something was coming, and the land had not forgotten him. The next morning he saddled his horse and started riding west. Some neighbors asked where he was headed. He had no clear answer. He only said he needed to check on something. As he rode, a feeling grew in his chest, a mix of unease and responsibility. The land had given him peace when he needed it most. Maybe now it was his turn to give something back. The trail grew familiar as he approached the old ridges. The sky darkened, heavy clouds rolling in, making the air tense. He remembered the exact spot where he had found the gold years ago. He expected silence, but instead he saw tracks. Fresh ones. Multiple riders, and something heavier dragged across the ground. His heart tightened. Someone had been digging. Someone who did not care about respect or boundaries. He dismounted and walked slowly across the ground, feeling the earth shift under his boots. He knelt near the place where the gold once lay buried, and his breath caught when he saw new scars in the soil, before he could make sense of what was happening. The wind shifted and carried distant movement toward him. He turned, scanning the ridge. A small group of Apache riders appeared, moving fast. Their horses thundered against the hard ground as they descended toward him. He did not know if they came as friends or if they thought he was part of the digging. All he could do was stand his ground and hope the past had not been forgotten. As the rider slowed. Surrounding him, one of them stepped forward. The cowboy recognized him even after so many years. It was one of the scouts who once watched him bury the gold. The man looked older now, stronger, carrying the weight of leadership in his voice. He stared at the cowboy in silence, the wind tightening the space between them. Then the scout pointed toward the ripped-open earth and said words that made the cowboy's heart pound in his chest. "You left what was ours. Now we have come to repay what is yours." Before the cowboy could ask what he meant, more riders appeared on the ridge. The ground trembled. The sky darkened. Something bigger was coming, something that would test every choice he had ever made, and the real story was just beginning. The cowboy stood still as the Apache riders circled him, their horses kicking dust into the air. The familiar scout who had spoken held his gaze with a steady calm, but there was weight behind his words that the cowboy did not yet understand. The clouds above thickened and the wind grew stronger, carrying the faint smell of approaching rain. The land felt tense, as if it remembered something the cowboy could not see. The scout pointed again to the torn ground and said the tribe had come to repay what was his. Yet nothing in the cowboy's life felt owed. For 13 years he had asked the world for very little and expected nothing in return. Now, standing between old ridges and fresh scars in the earth, he sensed something larger than personal history moving toward him. He took a step forward, slow and cautious, making sure not to be mistaken for a threat. The Apache riders watched every movement. Some held bows, others rifles, but none aimed them. Their eyes measured him with a mixture of recognition and urgency. The scout rode closer until their horses were only a few steps apart. The cowboy remembered the young boy he once saw on the ridge, thin and observant, but the man before him was different. Broader shoulders, sharper eyes, and a voice that carried authority earned through seasons of survival. The scout spoke again, saying trouble had come to their land, and it was tied to the gold the cowboy once found. Outsiders had returned with greed sharper than before, digging without care, crossing sacred lines, and bringing danger not only to the tribe but to anyone near the valley. The cowboy listened carefully, surprised that the mistake of another group of men could drag him into the storm. But the scout insisted that the tribe remembered his choice. The day he buried the gold and walked away, and they believed he had a part to play now. Whether he wished it or not, the cowboy looked at the torn ground, then at the riders, trying to piece together the storm brewing around them. He asked how many men had come and what they wanted. The scout replied that a group of prospectors had arrived weeks ago, claiming they discovered signs of gold and were determined to dig deeper. When warned to leave, they refused. They had brought tools and men from nearby towns, some willing to fight for riches they had not earned. The tribe had faced threats before, but this time the outsiders were pushing harder, convinced something valuable lay beneath the earth. The cowboy felt a twist in his chest. He had once held that same gold in his hand, felt its weight, and understood how it could make a weak man bold or a bold man reckless. Rain began to fall in thin drops that darkened the dust. The horses shifted, and some riders looked toward the ridge, as if expecting more movement. The cowboy sensed they were not alone. He asked the scout why they came for him when their warriors were strong enough to defend themselves. The scout said strength was not the issue. The outsiders believed the tribe was hiding gold, and they wanted proof. The rumor had spread through saloons and trading posts, poisoning minds with the promise of quick fortune. The tribe feared a clash that could cost lives on both sides. They believed that if the cowboy, the man who once walked away from the treasure, stood with them or spoke for them, it might change the outcome. But under the scout's steady voice there was something unsaid, something heavier. A sudden cry rose from the far ridge. One of the Apache riders broke off and galloped toward the sound, followed by another. The scout turned his head sharply, eyes narrowing. The cowboy could not see what stirred the alarm, but he knew danger had arrived sooner than expected. The scout motioned for the cowboy to follow and urged his horse up the path. The cowboy mounted quickly, gripping the reins as the group moved with urgency. The storm clouds grew thicker, the light dimming across the valley, giving the land a shadowed look that made everything feel unsettled. As they rode, the scout explained that the prospectors had not only dug up sacred ground, but had brought weapons, and some were willing to use them. The tribe had tried peaceful talks, doing all they could to avoid bloodshed, but the intruders believed they were being deceived. They had seen strange markings near the hills, remnants of old Apache rituals, and convinced themselves it was a sign of hidden wealth. The cowboy listened with growing unease. He knew how dangerous greed could be. He had seen men lose themselves chasing gold that swallowed their souls faster than fire. Swallows dry brush, the riders led him to a narrow pass where the land dipped low. Smoke rose in the distance, not from campfires but from something harsh and careless. The scent of burning wood filled the air. As they approached, the cowboy saw what caused the alarm. One of the old watch posts built by the tribe had been set aflame. The structure had stood for generations, a place where scouts kept watch over the valley. Now it smoldered, blackened and broken. The ground around it was trampled by unfamiliar boots. The cowboy felt anger rise in him, not loud or wild, but deep and steady, like heat under coals. The scout clenched his jaw. The riders spread out, scanning the area. The cowboy asked how long the prospectors had been this aggressive. The scout answered that it had started only a few days ago. Something had changed among them. They had found a clue or a sign that pushed them from simple digging to violent trespass. The tribe had tried to track what they discovered, but the outsiders guarded their movements. Rumors said they had stolen an old carving from a canyon wall, believing it would lead them to a treasure. That carving held meaning to the tribe, meaning far beyond gold. The cowboy felt tension grow inside him. He asked what the carving represented, but the scout said it was not yet time to speak of it. The rain grew heavier, washing ash down the burned beams. The wind carried the sharp scent of danger. The cowboy stood by the ruined watch post, feeling the weight of the moment. He had walked away from the gold years ago because it felt wrong to take what was not his. Now other men had come with greed and violence, turning sacred ground into a battlefield. The cowboy knew he could not ignore it. The land had given him peace once. Leaving it to be torn apart by men chasing fortune felt like turning his back on something he owed. The scout walked toward him. and said the tribe needed to show him something before the storm grew worse. They led him deeper into the pass, where the land rose on both sides, forming a natural path that wound through the hills. The cowboy followed, the sound of hooves echoing off the stone walls. The pass opened into a hidden clearing surrounded by rock formations carved by time. Here the air felt different, heavy with memory. The scout dismounted and motioned for the cowboy to do the same. They approached an old stone carving set into the cliffside. Its lines were worn but still strong, telling a story older than any living man. The scout traced a hand over it, explaining that the carving marked a place of protection, a sacred space where the tribe believed the earth watched over them. It was not about treasure, but about history and survival. The outsiders had taken a piece of this carving, believing it was a clue to gold hidden underground. They had no idea what they were playing with. The cowboy stepped closer, studying the ancient symbols. He felt a strange pull, as if the land itself was trying to speak through the stone. The scout said the tribe feared the outsiders would return soon, more desperate than before, and if they harmed the sacred places further, it could break the fragile peace that had held for years. The cowboy asked what the tribe expected from them. The scout did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the valley, where distant thunder rolled across the sky. He finally said the tribe believed the cowboy had been chosen by the land years ago when he decided to leave the gold untouched. They believed he understood respect in a way many outsiders did not. They believed he could help them prevent a war that no one wanted. The cowboy felt the weight of those words settle on him. He had never thought of himself as more than a man trying to live right, yet here he stood, pulled into a conflict that reached far beyond simple choices. Before he could respond, a sharp whistle cut through the air. One of the riders at the edge of the clearing signaled with urgency. More movement near the ridge. More smoke rising. More trouble coming. The scout tightened his grip on his reins. The cowboy felt the ground tremble beneath his boots. Something was approaching fast, and whatever it was carried danger with it. The storm clouds deepened, turning the sky into a heavy gray curtain. The cowboy took a deep breath, sensing the path ahead growing darker. The land he once respected was calling him again, not with quiet gratitude this time, but with a warning, and the real threat had only begun to show itself. The whistle from the rider cut through the air again, sharper this time, and every head in the clearing turned toward the ridge. The scout swung onto his horse in one quick move and signaled the others. The cowboy followed, his mind racing, feeling the pull of the land and the weight of the tribe's trust pressing into his chest. As they rode out of the narrow pass, the sky growled with distant thunder, and the first cold drops of real rain began to fall, dotting the leather of his saddle. He knew that whatever waited ahead was tied to the gold, the sacred land, and the restless greed that never stayed buried for long on the frontier. They climbed a rocky rise that overlooked a shallow valley. Below, near a dry creek bed, the cowboy saw them. A group of prospectors and hired men had set up a rough camp. Tents were thrown together beside wagons loaded with tools, rifles, and sacks. A tall man near the center pointed at the hills with a hard, impatient gesture, as if the land owed him something. The men around him laughed in short, nervous bursts, some watching the ridge, others hammering stakes into the ground. The cowboy could feel it even from a distance. They were not simple dreamers hunting for a better life. They were hungry for something that did not belong to them. The riders pulled back behind the ridge so they would not be seen. The scout studied the camp in silence, his jaw tight. He said the tall man was the one who had been pushing hardest, the one who claimed he had a right to dig where he pleased. He had paid locals to guide him close to Apache land and promised them a share of gold that had never been his to offer. The cowboy watched the way the men moved, the way they gripped their rifles while pretending to work. There was fear in their hands and greed in their eyes. A mix that often ended badly in the old American frontier, one of the Apache riders, younger and more restless, asked why they did not ride down and chase the prospectors off now. The scout answered that if they attacked first, the story told in nearby towns would not be about trespass or stolen carvings. It would be about savages attacking honest workers. The cowboy knew he was right. He had seen how quickly truth could be twisted when people wanted a reason to hate. The tribe needed more than anger. They needed proof, witnesses, and maybe a bridge between worlds that did not trust each other. The cowboy felt all eyes turn toward him for a moment. He was the outsider who had once refused the gold. Now he stood between two sides again, one bound by sacred land and memory, the other driven by hunger for wealth. He suggested he ride down alone under the excuse of looking for work or water, to listen and learn what the prospectors planned. The scout looked at him long and hard, weighing the risk. Finally he nodded. The riders would stay hidden along the ridge, ready to watch and move if things went wrong. The cowboy took a slow breath and guided his horse down the slope, leaving the shelter of the rocks. As he approached the camp, several rifles turned in his direction. He lifted one hand, open and calm, showing he carried no drawn weapon. The tall man stepped forward, eyes sharp, measuring every detail. The cowboy explained he had been riding through, heard there was digging in the area, and wondered if they needed help. The tall man looked him over, then lowered his rifle slightly. Prospectors always needed strong hands, and a stranger with a steady gaze could be useful, as long as he did not ask too many questions. The men at the camp introduced themselves in rough, half-hearted ways. Some had come from nearby towns, others from far states, all chasing the promise of frontier gold. The tall man talked the most. He spoke of new claims, of rich veins hidden in Apache land, and of a future where they would no longer have to answer to anyone. He said the tribe had no right to fences on land that was never written on any paper. The cowboy listened quietly, his face calm, but inside he felt anger stir. He knew how dangerous that kind of thinking was. It did not see people. It saw obstacles dot as the day moved on. The cowboy pretended to help around camp, carrying tools, leading a mule, watching every small sign. He saw a wooden crate set apart from the rest, guarded more closely. When the tall man stepped away, one of the younger prospectors let slip that the crate held something they had taken from the canyon. The cowboy's heart tightened. He guessed it was the piece of carving the tribe spoke of, ripped from the sacred stone. The prospector called it a map. He said the marks on it were numbers or directions. The cowboy knew better. Those marks were prayers, stories, and history burned into stone long before any mapmaker came west. As evening came, a few ranch hands from a nearby spread rode into camp. The cowboy recognized one of them. A man he had worked beside years ago, branding cattle under a merciless sun. The ranch hand was uneasy, glancing at the hills, saying the tribe was restless and that pushing too far into their land would lead to trouble. The tall man waved him off. He said trouble was coming either way and that he preferred to meet it with rifles rather than fear. He offered the ranch hands a share of gold if they agreed to stand with him when the tribe returned. Some hesitated. Others, tempted by the promise of money, tried to hide their interest. This became a second conflict in the cowboy's mind. Not just between the tribe and the prospectors, but inside the hearts of the locals. Some wanted peace and fair trade. Others wanted a shortcut to fortune. The cowboy watched his old acquaintance, saw the doubt in his eyes, and realized the man stood in the same place he once had. A place where a single choice could shape his life. The cowboy pulled him aside quietly and told him the truth about the sacred land, about the carving, about the risk of war that would not stop at the ridges. The ranch hand listened, but said he had a family to feed and debts that would not wait. Gold could wipe those away in a single season. Night fell slow and heavy over the camp. The men gathered around fires, some laughing too loud to hide their nerves, others drinking to quiet the fear that clung to their thoughts. The cowboy lay near his saddle, eyes half closed, pretending to rest while watching the crate. The tall man took it into his own tent, posting 2 guards outside. The sky above flashed with quiet lightning, and the wind picked up, carrying a low hum from the hills. The cowboy knew the tribe was there, watching, waiting for a sign of what he would do. The main conflict grew clearer in his mind. On one side, a tribe tied to the land by blood and memory, their sacred gold hidden not for wealth but for meaning. On the other, men who believed the frontier was made for taking. Between them, a line as thin as a horse's track in dust, easy to cross and hard to redraw. The cowboy felt he was standing on that line again, like the day he buried the gold and walked away. Only now the stakes were higher. Lives, not just choices, were at risk. At some point in the deep night, while the camp settled into a restless sleep, one of the younger prospectors slipped away from the fire and moved toward the hills alone. The cowboy noticed his absence and quietly rose to follow at a distance. The young man carried a small shovel and a lantern. Greed had driven him apart from his own group, pushing him to claim more than his promised share. He headed straight toward the edge of Apache land where old stones marked a boundary. The cowboy followed, his boots silent on the ground, knowing this was danger of a different kind. A broken promise inside the camp could spill into broken trust on the ridge. As the prospector knelt and began to dig at the base of a rock, his lantern throwing long shadows, the cowboy felt the air change. He glanced up to see faint shapes along the ridge, still and watchful. The tribe had seen him leave the camp. To them, he was another trespasser violating sacred ground while the others slept. The cowboy stepped forward, heart pounding, knowing he had moments to act before arrows or rifles answered the insult. He reached the young man and grabbed his arm, telling him sharply to stop. The prospector jerked in surprise, swung the shovel, and nearly struck him. In the struggle, the lantern tipped, its flame licking at the dry grass. The cowboy stomped it out with his boot, but the brief flare of light was enough. From the ridge came a low sound like a signal. The shapes in the darkness shifted. The night itself seemed to lean closer, holding its breath. The prospector pulled away, shouting that the gold was his, that he had seen the signs and would not be cheated. His voice echoed through the valley, bouncing off stone, reaching ears that were already on edge. The cowboy saw movement at the ridge and knew the tribe believed an attack had begun. At the same time, lights flickered back in the camp. The prospectors, half awake and confused, grabbed their rifles, thinking they were under threat from the hills. In that fractured moment, with both sides misreading each other and fear rushing faster than understanding, the cowboy stood alone between a shouting prospector and a watching tribe. The tension that had been building in the land now pressed in from all sides. The storm overhead rumbled a warning, and far off, a single shot cracked the air. Though no one could yet see who had fired or where it had come from, the silence that followed did not bring peace. It brought the sense that every small choice, from this point on, could decide whether the valley saw dawning calm or in chaos. The crack of that single gunshot rolled through the valley like a warning from the sky itself. Every sound stopped. Every breath caught. The cowboy felt the young prospector freeze beside him, shovel still in hand, eyes wide with fear he was trying to hide. The ridge above them grew still again, but in that stillness was danger waiting to spring. Light flickered from the camp as men scrambled from their tents, grabbing rifles and lanterns. Confusion moved between both sides like fire crawling through dry grass. Silent at first, then ready to explode, the cowboy raised both hands slowly, speaking in a calm voice to the prospector, telling him to stay quiet and drop the shovel. The young man's hands trembled. He looked toward the ridge, then toward the camp, unsure which side was the greater threat. The cowboy stepped between him and the carved stones, hoping the tribe could see he meant no harm. He knew they were watching. He could feel eyes on him even though he could not see their shapes in the dark. Shouts rose from the prospector's camp. Lanterns bobbed as men poured toward the ridge, afraid and angry. Some believed the tribe had shot first. Others accused the cowboy. The tall leader barked orders, demanding every man be ready. As more lights glowed, shadows stretched along the valley floor, twisting with each movement. The cowboy felt the tension coil tighter around him, each second pushing them closer to one wrong step that could set everything on fire. He called out loudly, telling the men from the camp that nothing had happened yet, that they should stand down. But fear made their hands shake, and shaking hands on rifles never led to peace. The tall prospector strode forward, furious, demanding to know why the cowboy was sneaking off into the hills. The cowboy said he had followed the young prospector to keep him from crossing sacred ground. The tall leader turned his anger on the young man, calling him a fool and accusing him of trying to steal from the group. The young prospector stammered, denying it, knowing too well that greed had led him here. The cowboy saw guilt in his eyes. He knew this was how conflict spiraled. One lie piled on another until a stampede of blame crushed everything in its path. More shapes appeared along the ridge. The tribe had moved closer, silent but present, watching the camp fill with rifles and anger. The cowboy recognized the scout among them, even though the dark hid much of his form. A single torch burned near the ridge, revealing painted symbols on the rocks behind the riders. The sight made the tall prospector laugh in a harsh, mocking way, calling the tribe superstitious and backward. The cowboy felt something inside him twist. He had seen what disrespect did to a land and the people who protected it. He stepped closer to the tall man and warned him to stop provoking a fight that would not end with anyone richer. The tall man shoved him back. The cowboy did not raise a hand in return, knowing violence from him would make everything worse. The tall man lifted his rifle and pointed it toward the ridge. That single action caused movement among the tribe, swift and sharp. The scout stepped forward, raising his hand as if to stop his own riders from firing. He shouted something in his language, a warning, a plea, or both. The cowboy felt the space between both sides shrinking, like the land was pulling them toward a collision neither wanted, but both were being pushed into. Thunder rolled overhead, shaking the ground. Rain began to fall again, heavier this time, making the soil slick and the rocks glisten. The cowboy raised his voice above the storm, shouting to both sides that killing each other was not going to reveal any gold, only bury the truth. He said gold had once been in these hills, but that it was never meant for outsiders. The tall man laughed again, accusing him of trying to scare them away from the treasure. He waved at his men, telling them the tribe was bluffing and that the land deserved to be mined. The scout rode a few steps forward from the ridge. His horse moved with steady calm, its hooves sinking into the wet soil. He told the prospectors the tribe had tried peace, tried warnings, tried offering safe passage if they left. He said the carving the prospectors stole was not a map, but a sacred marker, and taking it had awakened a wound in the land. The cowboy listened, feeling the truth of every word in the scout's voice. He saw hesitation flicker through some of the prospectors, especially the older ones who had lived long enough to know better than to toy with sacred places. The tall man refused to waver. He told the cowboy to step aside. He said he would fire into the ridge if the tribe did not retreat. The cowboy did not move. He stood between them, drenched from the rain, holding his ground. The tall man's anger grew sharper. He accused the cowboy of siding with the tribe, of being weak, of protecting people who stood in the way of progress. The cowboy answered that progress meant nothing if it crushed the lives of those who had been here long before them. The tall man raised his rifle higher. A sudden gust of wind knocked lantern light sideways, creating long, jerking shadows that made everything look unstable. The young prospector called out in fear, saying they should not fire. The ranch hand the cowboy once knew stepped forward from the camp and grabbed the tall man's arm, telling him he was about to make a mistake that could not be undone. Men from the camp argued among themselves, some siding with the tall man, others wanting to back down. The storm of greed and fear inside the group grew louder than the storm above them. The scout shouted again, telling the tribe to hold their arrows. His voice echoed through the valley, steady and commanding. The cowboy saw the irony. The tribe showed more restraint than the prospectors who claimed to be civilized. The rain hit harder, lightning cracked across the sky, lighting up the valley in a sudden white flash. In that brief light, the cowboy saw something frightening. More men were coming from the east. Riders, not from the tribe and not from the camp. A third group, the cowboy's heart dropped. These men were armed with longer rifles strapped across their saddles. Their faces were harsh, the kind of men who followed trouble instead of avoiding it. They rode with the confidence of those who believed they had nothing to lose. The tall prospector's expression changed. The cowboy understood why. These were men he had hired secretly, men who would use force without question if it meant clearing the land for mining. The tall man raised his hand and shouted to them, welcoming them like reinforcements in a war. The tribe saw the new riders too. The scout looked toward the cowboy, understanding now that the danger had doubled. This was no longer a simple dispute over gold. It was a fight the tall man had prepared long before tonight. Using hired guns to tip the balance, the cowboy felt the ground tilt beneath him. The third group's arrival meant the camp now had the power to start a battle the tribe could not avoid. The cowboy stepped closer to the tall man, voice low but sharp, asking if he had lost his mind. The tall man smirked, saying the land belonged to those strong enough to take it. The hired guns lined up behind him, rifles in hand, ready to fire at the ridge. The tribe shifted, weapons ready, but still waiting for the scout's signal. The cowboy stood between them all, soaked, tired, and angry, knowing the next few moments would determine everything. He felt the storm pressing down as if even the sky was bracing for the first shot. Then something unexpected happened. The young prospector, shaking, stepped forward and shouted the truth. He said the carving they stole was not a map. He said the tribe had shown restraint again and again. He said the tall man had lied to them, hiring gunmen to force a fight no one wanted. His voice cracked, but courage pushed it out. Some prospectors stared at him, shocked. Others refused to listen. The tall man cursed and raised his rifle to silence him. The cowboy lunged and grabbed the barrel, twisting it aside. The rifle fired, the shot ripping through the rain, echoing across the valley. The sound rolled into every ridge and hill, announcing that the fragile thread holding peace had snapped. The hired guns leaped from their saddles. Some prospectors fell back. The tribe tensed, arrows drawn, rifles ready. Lightning flashed again, turning every shape into a silhouette on the wet ground. The cowboy stood in the middle of a storm of fear and fury, knowing the next heartbeat could drown the valley in chaos. The scout locked eyes with him, waiting for the one choice that could either save them or destroy everything the cowboy had once tried to protect. The moment stretched thin as a wire, ready to break. And the real climax was just about to begin. The shot that cracked through the rain shook the valley to its core, but it did not bring the war that had been building on both sides. Instead, it carved out a brief silence where everyone stopped and looked toward the cowboy, the one man still standing between fear and disaster. The tall prospector tried to pull his rifle back, but the cowboy held it firm. He shouted loudly enough for both the tribe and the prospectors to hear, telling them that if another shot was fired, no one would walk away unchanged. His voice, steady but raw, cut through the storm. It was the voice of a man who had spent years respecting the land and had no wish to see it. Soaked in blood, the tall man cursed and tried to shove past him. But the ranch hand the cowboy once knew stepped forward and grabbed the tall man's shoulder. The ranch hand's eyes had changed. They no longer held uncertainty. He said no gold was worth a life, and no promise of fortune was worth tearing apart the valley or the tribe that had guarded it for generations. More prospectors stepped beside him, siding with reason over greed. The young prospector, shaken from nearly being shot, bravely repeated the truth about the carving and begged the others to listen before everything fell apart. The hired gunmen looked uncertain. They had been promised pay for a simple job, not a battle between two worlds. Some exchanged glances, realizing they had stepped into something deeper than the tall man had explained. The scout raised his voice then, saying the tribe did not wish for war. They had only wanted their land respected and their history left untouched. Rain poured harder, as if washing away the anger inch by inch. The storm felt less like a curse and more like a turning point, offering a chance to choose peace. Slowly, the cowboy lowered the barrel of the tall man's rifle. He let go but kept his eyes on him. The tall man's pride fought one last time, but even his hired men were stepping back. When he looked around, he saw fewer eyes and more faces showing doubt. He shouted that they were all fools for walking away from gold that could change their lives. But his voice cracked in a way that revealed more desperation than power. One hired gunman asked him if he had ever even seen the gold. The tall man hesitated. That single pause told the truth. He had been chasing a rumor, a story, and his hunger had nearly turned it into a tragedy. The scout dismounted and walked toward the group. The tribe's riders stayed on the ridge, but their bows lowered. The scout carried the piece of the carving wrapped in cloth. With calm steps he approached the cowboy first. He said the land had remembered the cowboy's choice years ago when he found gold and left it untouched. Now, the tribe would return that respect. He handed the wrapped carving to the cowboy and asked him to place it back where it belonged. Believing only he could set things right without provoking more hostility, the cowboy walked toward the sacred stone wall. The rain soaking through his shirt, his boots heavy in the mud. He felt every eye on him, from the ridge to the camp. When he knelt and placed the carving back into its space, the stones seemed to settle with a sound that blended with the rain. It was not magic. It was history returning to where it lived. When he stood again, the scout nodded, a silent thank you that carried years of meaning. The tall prospector tried one last desperate attempt to rally his men, shouting that the carving was proof of something valuable. But his words no longer held the power they had before. Men he had misled looked away, ashamed. One of the hired gunmen walked up to him, pulled the rifle gently from his hands, and laid it on the ground. The tall man stared at the weapon as if it were the last piece of a dream slipping out of reach. Then he turned and walked away into the darkness alone. Defeated by his own greed rather than by any enemy, the prospectors who stayed behind apologized to the tribe. Some spoke through the cowboy, who translated the meaning even if not every word. The scout accepted the apologies with quiet dignity. He said the tribe would not carry the anger forward if the men left peacefully and never returned to dig again. The prospectors nodded, grateful for mercy they did not fully deserve. The ranch hand thanked the cowboy for stepping in before things became worse. He said he had nearly let desperation blind him and that he would never forget how close he came to losing himself. For the promise of gold, the tribe guided the cowboy and the remaining prospectors back down the ridge so everyone could leave the valley without misunderstanding. The storm began to ease. The clouds pulled apart just enough for the moonlight to slip through, touching the hills with pale silver. It felt like the land itself was breathing easier. As the camp broke apart, men loaded wagons quietly, each carrying their own lessons home. The cowboy helped the young prospector pack, telling him that this was a chance to start over without letting greed shape his path. The young man nodded, humbled and changed by everything he had seen. Once the prospectors left, only the tribe and the cowboy remained near the ridge. The scout invited him to join them for a moment of thanks. They led him to a fire burning under a cliff ledge, its glow warm and steady in the damp night. An elder stepped forward and spoke in a gentle tone. The scout translated, saying the cowboy had acted with the heart of someone who understood respect, not just for land but for people. The elder said the tribe repaid debts in ways that did not always involve gold. They repaid them with trust, protection, and shared peace. The cowboy nodded gratefully. He said he had only done what felt right, nothing more. The scout smiled and told him that sometimes doing the right thing was the hardest choice a man could make, and that choice alone had saved lives on both sides. As the fire crackled, the tribe offered him food and a warm seat. The night no longer held fear. It carried a feeling of unity that rarely existed between cowboys and Apache riders. Before the cowboy left, the scout gave him something wrapped in a small deerskin pouch. The scout said it would not make him rich, but it would bring luck and remind him of the night when the valley chose peace over conflict. Inside the pouch was a single small gold piece, shaped naturally, untouched by tools. It was not from the sacred ground. It was a token from the tribe's own history, given only to those who had earned trust through actions rather than words. The cowboy held it gently, humbled. He rode out before dawn, the land quiet and washed clean by the storm. The air smelled fresh, like new beginnings. As he reached the edge of the valley, he looked back once more. The tribe stood on the ridge, watching him leave, not as a stranger, but as an ally. He touched the small gold piece in his pocket, feeling its warmth. It symbolized something far greater than wealth. It was a reminder that respect had brought him full circle. From the day he walked away from gold to the night a tribe honored him for it. As he rode toward the open plains, he felt lighter. He had no land to call his own, no riches waiting for him, but he carried something worth more. He had earned the trust of people who had every reason to doubt outsiders. He had helped protect sacred land from being broken apart. and he had shown that even in the old American frontier, where greed ran wild, a man's choices could still shape his destiny. The sun rose behind him, spreading warm light across the land. The cowboy smiled softly. He knew the valley was safe, the tribe at peace, and the threat gone. And somewhere in that wide land, a story about him would be told for years. A story of a cowboy who once found gold on Apache land and left it untouched, only for the tribe to repay him in the way that mattered most. With that, he rode on, ready for whatever the open frontier held next, knowing he had done right by the land and by the people who lived upon it.